Hello, it's just David here with a message for this week. I don't know if you've come across it, and in a way, if you haven't, that's quite good. But there's been a bit of controversy this week in the church, which all began on Twitter. And one of the things about controversy in Twitter, and it's probably best not to add to them, in my experience. So I want to say a little bit about that and just put it in perspective for those of you who have seen it. And then also actually say a bit more about what might underlie these things and what it says about how we talk to each other. It's a really rather unfortunate story, to be honest. So there is in London a clergyman who tweeted something just after Captain Tom Moore died, and it mentioned him, it praised him, but it was critical of the reaction to his death, some of the things which were proposed should happen. And many people took it to be slightly offensive, saw it as, perhaps not reading it very carefully, and saw it as in some ways sort of insulting Captain Tom's memory. The person who wrote it was an experienced tweeter, and frankly, in that sense, I think they did make a mistake. I think, using his death as a sort of launch pad for something else was a foolish mistake, and should have known better. And actually, the person who did it, the clergyman who did it, realised that. He deleted it, he came off Twitter and agreed to do some further training. What didn't help, really, was several factors after that. I mean, first of all, it sort of went viral, went everywhere. But then sort of people piled in on this, and that's probably more of a lesson than the original tweet. So it didn't help that the clergy person who tweeted it was black and gay. And so an awful lot of people, piled in with their own responses to his. Some of them were measured, some of them were upset, but sadly a lot of them were very, very offensive, particularly about his race and sexual orientation. And that was very, very unfortunate, and goodness knows the pain he must have, got from one ill-judged, perhaps, tweet. Then, of course, it gets all worse. The Diocese of London decided to get involved. It's from the Diocese of London. And obviously they seemed to want to make sure it didn't reflect badly on them. So they came in. And again, I think quite heavily. There was a condemnation of all the racism and homophobia, but also a fairly strong, really a very strong public rebuke of him, which I think was probably slightly over the top, and also suggesting that perhaps his job would be reviewed. So then, every action has an equal and positive opposite reaction. So then a load of other people who sort of were slightly on his side then sort of came in and said, hang on, this is an overreaction. He didn't mean to be offensive in the way you said it to. At worst, he was naive, and actually some of the points he raised in the tweet were good and valid, and really to say now that his job's in jeopardy is a bit much. And that particularly as he is black and gay, and the minorities which receive a lot of abuse, we ought to be rather more supportive of him. It's probably kind of going on as I speak. It's all very unfortunate. I say in a sense I don't want to add to it. But I think it does highlight one of the, both the dangers of particularly Twitter and social media, and also not to underplay their joys. I mean, I'm all for social media. I think we should realise what these things are for. I mean, basically, it seems to me they're there to give sort of fairly bland piece of information, times of your services in church, for instance, and some of the things that you're trying to do. And then funny videos of cats and things. That's terrific, or silly, funny things that nobody could take offence at. Yeah, that's all great and fun and good. But I always slightly sort of worry when people, I mean, suddenly if they say something controversial, but also just if they say something slightly more serious, I do kind of worry about the whole format. And I'll tell you why. There's several reasons. So I think one of the things, of course, is Twitter is in a sense the worst place, because if you don't know Twitter, what it limits you to is 280 characters, which is a nice, fun thing. It encourages people to write sort of funny, brief, interesting, informative things, not great screeds of stuff. But of course, the trouble is when it comes to kind of quite subtle, controversial, difficult, nuanced subjects, if you limit people to 280 characters, they can't quite say what they mean. They can't give context. They can't sort of allow for opposing points of view. They have to come in sort of very hard with their point very briefly. And then so do all the other people who comment of that, and there are thousands. And I think probably if you want to introduce quite a subtle thing, then the Twitter isn't the way to do it. And that actually, you do have to think how other social media work as well, as to whether they're the best place for those sorts of serious debates. Also, of course, what tends to happen with social media, and particularly with sort of things like maybe Facebook's a different thing, is of course you get this echo chamber effect that you are following or befriending people. And the thing is, you tend to sort of, befriend people who are rather like you. So you see this a lot on Facebook in particular. I think Twitter's a bit more kind of open, but people make friends with people who are rather like them, and it doesn't really help kind of with unconscious bias and diversity if you've selected the people who are going to sort of see what you've written, because of course most of them probably share the views, and very often will sort of send back a kind of thing that says, yes, yeah, how right you are. And whereas, you could look at completely different set of friends who have completely opposite points of view. And so sometimes it can feel as though, oh, well, everybody agrees with me. Whereas in fact, what you're saying is, well, everybody who I'm friends with and is rather like me agrees with me. And that's rather a different thing. So I think that's another danger. Of course, a great danger as well, and I was thinking this, I mean, this isn't anything really to do with social Twitter, but the social media really, but I mean, I was reading sort of letters written at the Reformation the other day, and you can certainly read a lot of other kind of things where people write letters to one another, where they're, not only can you not meet the person at the moment, but you're unlikely to meet them, and with kind of social media, probably a lot of them, never will meet all the people who will tweet back and forward ever in your life. Of course, that doesn't help courteous dialogue. Very often sometimes you get these rows with people, and you get I've come across it as well. You get people have this furious rows on email or something. You sit them in a room together, and suddenly they're all very reasonable. It's probably happened to me as well. But there is something about actually when you get into a room with somebody, you tend to have a different dynamic than if you're just writing stuff, particularly if you're writing it into the ether to people you'll never meet. I mean, the House of Commons is a good example. I mean, people notice the first thing you go into the House of Commons is that how small it is, and how close the people are together. So I think it's supposed to be, isn't it, the width across the benches is the length of sort of 2 arms, 2 swords, and a few inches. So the whole design of the House of Commons is you can't actually strike the person opposite with you. You can't, there can't be some terrible fight, but actually you have to get, that barge, you have to get as close to them as you can to make your point from the front benches to them. And of course, sometimes it does look terribly gladiatorial, but I kind of think it would be better than, a huge chamber where you can just sort of shout across the room. to each other. I think that intimacy and that smallness of the chamber in the House of Commons is quite important. And then, of course, I think the other thing is this whole thing of sort of what people going viral. If you don't know what that means, slightly unfortunate sort of analogy at the moment. But what it means is that you know, most people put things on social media, and you know, 20 people will give it a thumbs up or a laugh or a little comment or something, and then it'll die, and you know, that'll be it. Just occasionally, rather like this sort of London clergyman, people say things and then, you know, just spirals out of control. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people pick up on it and all give their own interpretation, etc., 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 until it becomes a big news story. So there's one recently where it's become a comedy sensation. I think it's the Handworth Parish Council. Now, I mean, you know, parish council meetings are happening by Zoom and happen up and down the country, and most of them are necessary. But forgive me, councillors, you know, probably quite tedious. This, because they had a kind of sort of rather splendid row at the beginning of it, has turned into sort of internet sensation. And again, you know, there are now hundreds of thousands of people who've watched Handforth, I think it's called, Parish Council, have a very acrimonious but slightly funny meeting. And I mean, that's what strikes me. And I mean, whatever you think about what this guy tweeted, I can tell you that, you know, if you look at tweets, just looking down, you know, in any 24-hour period from a group of food tutors, you will find a lot more stupid and frankly offensive things said than this guy ever said. But because it was picked up on, because it went viral, because, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, then, you know, then other people kind of need to get involved. The diocese needs to go, you know, can he carry on in his job, etc., etc. And I think that's not very good, because that becomes sort of trial by social media. You know, it's the number of retweets or, you know, forwards or whatever it is that actually means that somebody has to take action, rather than the actual graveness of the offence. I think that's really quite. I think that's not very good. I you know, bad things ought to be called out and, if necessary, action taken. But that can't depend on how many people see it. You know, that is wrong. So I think it's an unfortunate incident. And you see, I mean, sometimes people think, you know, well, that just could, you know, didn't really like social media. Well, no, that's not true at all. What I do think, though, is what's happened is, and I think this is the sort of lesson to take away, is that we've got lots of different social media that have come along. Now, you know, people have written letters for thousands of years, and we got quite used to what it was appropriate to write in a letter. And as I say, even so, I mean, I say, you know, very often letter writing could get very acrimonious, very controversial. And of course, that was the way controversies were carried on for millennia. Then the telegraph or the telegram came along, and suddenly one of the worries about the telegram and telegraph was, you know, would it destroy the art of letter writing? And because people would write much shorter telegrams, would it mean that people would be, you know, very brusque and rude? And we kind of got over that. But then, you know, I think this is what has happened in the digital revolution of the last 20 years, is that there's now, whereas there were 2 or 3 formats to communicate, now there's, you know, 30. You know, there's email, texting, there's messaging of various sorts, there's Facebook, there's Twitter, there's Instagram, there's TikTok. And each of them has their kind of own dynamics and their own problems. Some have video, some have limits on the character, some there's limits on who sees it, some is just broadcast everywhere. You know, and a lot of it sometimes depends on you knowing the settings of those various programs, etc., etc. And you hit the wrong button, it goes to wrong people, and all those sorts of things. And I do think it's kind of just been too much for us as a society, that we've, you know, it takes us time to adjust to those different things. And I say, when telegrams were first invented, people, you know, took a decade or two to work out, you know, what was good in the telegram, what was good in a letter, what needed a face to face. And now these things have come on after each other very, very quickly. And I think there is a case for saying, let's just think carefully, a bit more carefully about, you know, how we're going to be courteous and use these things to mean that we communicate stuff and we have fun. I mean, I'm all for the fun bits of it, you know, funny videos of dogs, that's terrific, lovely, etc., etc. You know, the fun of it, but it does have its dark side, and you know, you get that in trolling and, as I say, this kind of trial by social media. And I think, yeah, and that's just because we're not very mature in it. I don't mean we're immature as individuals. I mean, we're not. It's not a mature. None of these medium are allowed time to mature, so that we know how to do it. So I think we have to be very careful about them, and we have to think, you know, for each different thing, how might this be used? How might it be sort of courteous and funny and life affirming and all the rest of it, as it can be. I mean, no doubt. I mean, I belong to these things, and in some ways, they're great, or they could be great. They have potential to be great, but if we're going to also get away from that potential to be really rather bad, nasty, unhelpful places, then we are going to have to put that sort of hard work as a society into thinking, how do we use these things?